All right, I'll share my screen now.
You good?
Yep.
I don't see anything yet, but.
Yep, working on it.
Oh, there we are. Okay. All right, welcome everyone. My name's Kevin Vogel. I'm going to be your host today. And today I have Ariel, and I'm going to butcher your last name. So why don't you just give him your last name, tell him who you are.
Hey everybody, so Ariel Posada. My last name is Cuban at birth, so you could pronounce it Posada. You could pronounce it like the baseball player, Posada, however you want. I really don't, not picky.
All right, and today we're going to be unlocking the power of your Microsoft security investment. And Ariel's going to be walking through just a few slides. This is very, very open forum. Please, I'm going to be monitoring any questions you might have for Ariel along the way. And we'll be asking questions and trying to get your feedback as we go. With that, Ariel, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. So, hey everybody. So just to add to what Kevin said, as I'm walking through some of the, the content we'll be talking about today, any questions, again, just kind of, put it on the chat. Kevin will, stop me and we'll review those questions. I want to make sure we address all of your concerns or questions in, real time, to make sure that, the content is sticky, right? So again, don't be shy, just type it in there and, Kevin will let me know what it is and we can discuss it. Let's keep it as much interactive as we possibly can. So again, to what Kevin mentioned, right? The title of today's presentation is kind of unlock the power of the Microsoft security investment. And Microsoft, as everyone's been kind of in tune in the last, let's say, 3 to 4 years, they've really come a long way in their investment they've done with security. With the bundles they originally came to be as the E3s with EMS, then the E5s, and those bundles had a lot of security in it, right? It all started with the ability to unify the endpoint with, upgrading the different capabilities of SCCM, and those initial start at what the full suite of security that they currently have today. But in today's presentation, we're going to talk a little bit more in the threat management landscape using the Microsoft M365 with Sentinel landscape, and kind of what services could be layered on top of that technology to really give you a full holistic management of just the technology in a 10-year capacity. So let me just make sure my keyboard works here. There we go. Hey, Kevin, just a quick check before I continue. On the screen, everything is good? Everything is moving along?
Everything's moving on. And
okay.
just to clarify the licensing piece of this, so obviously with the Microsoft 365, now is this with the security add-on or with the compliance add-on? Do you because now Microsoft, they one thing Microsoft loves to do is make licensing as confusing as humanly possible.
Yeah, no, I agree to that. Microsoft, unfortunately, that's one thing they've never really addressed. I think they should hire a group of people to fix that. So their licensing schema, you do need a little bit of a degree to understand it. But the most simplistic way that I like to articulate the licensing, as a rule of thumb, right? When we're without being up to date on the minute, on the hour, but the rule of thumb is that what we're going to talk about today, which is the Defender suite of products, they're going to be found in what's called the EMS bundle, which is an addition to E3, or of course they're going to be found in E5, which involves everything that Microsoft has. So the rule of thumb is either an E3 EMS, right? You could always purchase everything we're going to talk about here a la carte, or of course if you have an E5, everything we're going to talk about today is already included. And we're going to tap a little bit into that in the last bullet, as you see here, in the ROI of making sure that you're utilizing all of these different, grade A technologies. If you were to look at Forrester or Gartner, make sure you're getting the investment, that return on that investment that was already done. The only caveat to the question will be when we talk about Sentinel. Sentinel is license agnostic because it only charges via consumption. So we'll talk a little bit into that. When it comes to Sentinel, there's non-billable and billable log sources. So it actually is a really good benefit, because if you're using your E3 EMS bundle security technologies, or with the E5, all of that telemetry coming out of Defender for Endpoint, right? Defender for Office, Cloud App Security, and Defender for Identity, that's non-billable. So it's what I like to call, the free 99, which everyone likes. So that's a really big differentiator from a pricing perspective when you're solely talking about Sentinel. So that's a good point that Kevin brought, because unfortunately the licensing, it is a little complicated, but the rule of thumb is keep in mind the E3 EMS and the E5 bundles, as well as Sentinel being license agnostic. It just depends on the consumption. So if you're planning on migrating from a legacy SIM, or you're migrating from a SIM that's maybe, getting a little too costly, the what's called the ASR, which is the consumption calculation that you do in Sentinel, it is a little different, and there's a big benefit in reduction because of that non-billable log source aspect that's attached to it. But that's a really good question, Kevin.
Right, and for you guys, if you want us to, we do this pretty much every single day of our lives, is look at people's licensing, look at what you have available, make sure that if you're looking for Defender for Endpoint or Defender for Identity, that you have the right licenses. Because there's things like F5s, believe it or not, first line workers and things like that. There's even a security add-on that you can do. So, we'll give you a hand with licensing. I just want to let you know that, that's one of the services that we offer, is just the ability to take a look at what you have and make sure that you have what you need. Sorry about that. I just
No,
wanted to
that's a good question. That comes up a lot. So I'm glad that we can kind of talk a little bit at first. And again, as I walk through it, if there's any questions, be my guest. But we're going to talk about 5 core things in today's presentation, right? The first one, we're going to kind of navigate a little bit into what the current landscape looks like when it comes to threat and vulnerabilities, and how we differentiate between the two. I know those 2 words in our industry and security is used loosely and interchangeably, but we're going to talk a little bit of an academic level articulation of the two, so we understand what the key difference is between when we're saying threat and when we're saying vulnerability, how they kind of differentiate, and then how the technologies apply to it in order to detect on those vulnerabilities and those threats. Then we're going to dive a little bit into the cloud security threat, right? Because threats and vulnerabilities are no longer just your on-prem architecture, your infrastructure, your network segments, right? In the last couple of years, they've aggressively moved to the cloud. So now you have cloud workloads that you have to be considering in your security posture. You have workloads like IoT, databases with SQL, right? There's a lot of things covering now as folks have migrated their workloads over to the cloud. And even though we're talking Microsoft and protecting against those threats, I will go into how Microsoft has scale outside of just the Azure cloud. So you could do the same level of protection and having the threat mitigation that you need to have in place, but doing that in GCP, doing that in AWS, doing that on your and when I say on-prem, I'm talking about private cloud, as well as your Azure. So you have the ability to understand the landscape across the board, even if you have a multi-cloud environment, right? From that point on, we're going to move into aligning all those known threats that we just talked about, and making sure how do those threats start aligning to controls, right? Because there's a lot of threats out there, but they're single instances if left on its own, right? They have to be aligned to a control, because controls are your safeguards that are going to be in place. And then those safeguards, those controls, they're going to have alignments, right, as well into regulatory, statutory, or contractual obligations and mandates. So we're going to talk about how kind of all of that integrates and creates that stickiness between with the vulnerability, the threat, the risk to the organization, how that attaches to the controls, and basically how you get everything else down the pipeline, right? Once all of that is kind of articulated, we're gonna go directly into how are we detecting that, right? We're gonna go a little bit to the platform and see how we're utilizing the Microsoft horsepower to detect all of these threats that are identified within the organization, right? And then lastly, we're going to finish off with the return on the investment that you folks have done or are planning on doing with Microsoft Security, right? So those 5 are going to be the core aspects of what we're going to talk about today. So let's get started. So calculating the efficacy of the threat, right? Well, like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, there's that loosely kind of way of saying, oh, that's a vulnerability, oh, that's a threat, that's a vulnerability, that's a threat. But to be specific, in order for a threat to be considered a true positive threat, there has to be a calculated capability with intent and opportunity, right? Once you have a capability like, listed, you have intent, right? And you have opportunity, that's when you can sign off, right? Check off, okay, this is a real threat. And again, intent is kind of, as I wrote here on the bottom, it's the goal the adversary wants to achieve, right? That could be from exfiltrating your data, right? Because of the industry you're in. Like if you're healthcare, they're going to target your PHI. If you're a law firm, they're going to target your PII and kind of your cases that you have. If you're dealing with insurances, they're going to target that PII as well as the ability, and or if you're like pharmaceutical where you have proprietary information, IP, that they're going to target, right? So that's the intent. Then we get to capability, which is really key because the capability is the ability for the adversaries to successfully breach the organization, right? So for example, if you're analyzing a threat, are those capabilities there? Meaning, is that threat internal? Is that threat external? Is it both? So depending on how you analyze the capability, it's going to start kind of giving you an inclination into this is really a threat or not. And then lastly is the opportunity. And opportunity is key in the formula because when you get to mitigation, that threat minus the opportunity becomes your mitigation, right? So, and that's where the key term starts coming in with vulnerability. Because if you take away that vulnerability from the threat, right, you kind of took away the opportunity for that threat to be enacted. So you mitigated that threat by releasing the vulnerability. And that's why patch management, and we do a lot of it with SCCM. Well, starting with SCCM, we moved into co-manage or Intune, where that vulnerability management, that patch management, all that TVM capability is critical because by doing so, you're alleviating the opportunity of the threat from actually happening, right? And ultimately, what I'm trying to get to is, as you can see here on the right-hand side, is you can look at the intent, the capability, and the opportunity, and only when all 3 of them are there is it truly called a threat. If it's missing capability, right, then it's really an impeding threat. If it's missing intent, then it's just a potential threat, or it could be an insubstantial threat and there's no opportunity. So you got to have the opportunity, you got to have the capability, you got to have the intent, and then okay, now you have an official threat on your hand. And I used the other kind of graphics on the left hand side because people tend to confuse, okay, this is a threat with a vulnerability in order to calculate risk, right? And risk is the equivalent of how we measure a threat, but it's taken into consideration the impact on the organization. So if you have a vulnerability that's there, right, you have not patched it, or maybe you cannot patch it because the vendor hasn't released a patch. So you have to have compensating controls. But you do know that is a threat. You do know that you have the vulnerability. And now you know the impact of the organization because let's say this is a Salesforce type of event, Kaseya, SolarWinds, some of those big ones, right? The impact is strong. So that's how you calculate risk. It's the likelihood of that threat becoming possible due to the vulnerability times the impact that gives you your risk rating. And I know that's a very simplistic way of kind of calculating risk, but that is a key differentiator as we look at the Microsoft stack in understanding what is the vulnerability, how is Microsoft calculating vulnerability, how is Microsoft calculating threat, how are they articulating the differences between the two, right, in order. So when I get, like I say, a scorecard, or I get a report out of the stack, that when they say, okay, I reduced the risk by X number, that's how it's all calculated, right? So that's, and by the way, I know I'm going to probably talk a lot, but we're going to convert this slide and we're going to send it out at the end, so everyone's going to have a copy of it. So applying everything I just talked about, right, into the threat and vulnerability management of what Microsoft has to offer. The first thing we get to is Defender for Endpoint, right? That's the continuous discovery of everything that's happening in the landscape of all of your different, endpoints within your organization, right? The prioritization with threat insight, breach insight, business context, that happens through the threat intelligence that Microsoft provides via the unified data management platform they have in the back end. And then you have your automated compensation, which is integrated into the endpoint in order to actually do something about it, right? And ultimately, as you can see, you have the risk in the middle, right? Because you're merging the impact to the endpoint with the vulnerability and the threat. So that's very, very, very high level. That's how we start getting with Defender for Endpoint as an EDR solution. We start targeting the threats and vulnerability. And Defender for Endpoint does become a little bit different than some of the other of its competitors because it has TVN module built into it. So you actually are constantly scanning for vulnerabilities and threat within the landscape through the EDR agent that you already have or are planning on delivering to the entire organization. So if you were to log into the self-service portal, right, the security.microsoft.com, you could actually click on the threat and vulnerability management link, and you see everything that's happening within all your endpoints. Just like if you're running something like, say, Qualys or Rapid7, it's the equivalent of that. And actually, a feature that was released, I think it was mid to Q3, Q4 last year, you could actually now, through Defender for Endpoint, you could actually perform external scans of things like perimeters and everything else by creating a proxy installation of the TVM capability. And all of that will be centralized in your Defender for Endpoint console. So it goes outside of the endpoint and it starts scanning for threats and vulnerability across your entire landscape. And as you can see here, right, that continuous monitoring that's happening within the sensor that's sitting on the endpoint is performing a lot of different things, right? It's giving you that configurational score, that exposure score. It's giving you full software inventory because it's analyzing everything that's in the endpoint. And then you have weaknesses and vulnerability. You know, a key example of how the software inventory and weaknesses and vulnerability came in very, very handy was about 2 months ago when Log4j came out. Defender for Endpoint as a technology stack was really quickly able to understand what software packages were installed, what softwares were vulnerable via the versioning that were vulnerable to the Log4j, and quickly they were able to give you a threat analysis on everything that was Log4j related, which endpoints were vulnerable and needed to be patched, which directories the jar file was identified via the environmental variable, which software needed to be upgraded that had the jar file in it. So because of the TVM capability, a perfect example that just happened 2 months ago, using the threat and vulnerability management, everything could have been identified in just one quick pane of glass. So that's just a quick example of how TVM doing threat and vulnerability management at the endpoint became extremely useful in a scenario like Log4j, right? But again, all of that is at the endpoint level, right? Just like I spoke about before, you want to make sure that your vulnerability and threats are comprehensive, not just at the endpoint, but also across the cloud as well, because we moved a lot of workloads in the last couple of years, 3 years, into the cloud because of how, there's a lot of good reasonings why. Every company has their own reasoning, but they're all good into why you want to move to the cloud. But you also want to be able to manage everything in a centralized pane. So Azure released Azure Art, and Azure Art is a multi-cloud managing platform, which allows you to understand and allows you to deploy all of the Defender suite of products across not just Azure, but also your on-prem private data center, as well as your Amazon Web Services and Google Cloud. Now you have your entire infrastructure, virtual or containerized, across multi-clouds, and you can manage all of it through one platform. And that platform has native capability and integration into something like Sentinel and Intune in order for everything to kind of be one unified management of all of the security posture, right? And as you can see here, you have the security posture and compliance, which is going to give you your policies, your secure score, and manage all your assets. But as well as you're going to have your server protection, which is Defender for Cloud for VMs, which is the threat protection that we just talked about, as well as your automation and management scale, right? And all of that,
Can I
right?
ask you a question about that real quick there,
Of
Ariel?
course.
I'm sorry.
No.
Especially because I'm not very familiar with the Microsoft Defender for Cloud for VMs. That's one that I haven't worked with. And it says application control. So is it dependent upon the application that you're running? And does it support, like, it can't support every application, but does it support most applications?
Yeah, you actually, when the application aspect of it, it basically means that you have application whitelisting and application blacklisting capabilities. So basically, within the server protection, as you're doing your Microsoft Defender for Cloud on the VM, you can actually, analyze all of the traffic based on all applications. So I've seen applications that are not compatible, but in the history of since Microsoft for Cloud Apps came out, recently they are expanding so aggressively that I haven't had that conversation in a very long time where something wasn't compatible. Microsoft has partnered with a lot of different vendors and have done a lot of good work in scaling that application list. So I haven't really seen any sort of application in a while that wasn't compatible.
And it supports Microsoft and Linux-based OSs?
Yes, and Mac.
Okay, see, didn't know that. You just taught me something I didn't know.
Yeah, and actually all of last year, they did extensive releases of the capability with Mac and Linux, because there's and Linux and not Mac solely, but Linux is a little bit of a different beast because there's 800 flavors, a lot of different kernels, and you want to make sure that you deliver the same capabilities of like isolation capabilities, all those different aspects of what Defender brings to the table from a security perspective, that you're able to do that across all of the different versions. So Microsoft pretty much spent all of last year doing a lot of releases and pumping a lot of good features into making sure that they blend the capabilities that everyone was liking and loving in Windows, right? That you could also do the same thing in Windows and Linux and Mac operating systems.
All right, so all of these three pieces are part of Arc. Is that what is that
Yeah,
the best way to look at?
Exactly. So Arc gives you all of these features while doing it in a multi-cloud facet. So you can do the same thing with your Azure as well as all of your VMs and infrastructure that's sitting on Google Cloud and Amazon Web Services.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. I appreciate that.
Yep. No, Azure Arc was specifically made for that because that was a lot of the complaints for people that were running multi-cloud. They said, oh, I got 1,000 servers in AWS and I got 1,000 servers in Azure, but I got to manage it separately. So Microsoft then went back to the drawing board and created the Azure Art Platform. So you can do in one single pane of glass, you can manage the infrastructure sitting on two different clouds, right? But once you have the threat and vulnerabilities lined out, right, into how you are identifying one and the other, you're doing it on your on-prem private cloud, you're doing it on your multiple cloud infrastructure, and now you have full visibility into your architecture, but you have to align now all those threats to a control, and then the services that are going to be run on top of that technology, right, which is when something like an MSSP comes in, because you have to make sure that these controls and these services are aligned to the threat detection that's going to happen 24/7, 365, right? Unfortunately, the threat actors don't, they're out there not taking breaks, still working on holidays. So we have to make sure that we have a system in place where all those threats have controls behind it for mitigation, and there's a service attached to it where everything is constantly being responded to. And the way that we have kind of aligned those threats, organized as a taxonomy, all of those different threats, align controls to those threats, and then layered a full service approach to everything that we just talked about, is utilizing the MITRE ATT&CK threat library. And I know some people call it a framework. That's fine. It is ultimately is a threat library. It's a way of organizing with horizontal and vertical different organizational patterns based on all the TTPs. It's able to organize all of the different threats and apply enrichment to it. So just like as you see here, we're getting all of the different threats. We're organizing all of the different TTPs based on everything we're seeing on the endpoint. We're doing threat intelligence. We're responding to the vulnerability. We're doing that correlation and asset impact. And we're creating security incidents, all aligning all those TTPs, which are the techniques that are identified and the tactics that are identified within the library, and enriching each one of those IOCs and creating a case management. All of that, of course, is being enriched at the SIM. So this is where all of the information that I just talked about in the EDR, Defender for Cloud Apps, Defender for Identity, and even the email gateway, which is Defender for Office, now starts aggregating into the SIM, right? So now we start kind of having that conversation of Sentinel, right? Because we managed to understand where are the threats, where are the vulnerabilities, how to have visibility across your landscape, including the cloud workloads, right? And then organizing all of those threats in a way that you could actually start taking actions using MITRE ATT&CK. But once all of that is organized, enriched, and labeled, and you pump all of that in a central repository, which is where the SIM comes in, you have to make sure that those detections happen correctly, right? So as an example of what Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, as well as the different Defender into Sentinel, the SIM and the SOAR, this is how everything comes into play, right? As you can see here, you see what MITRE looks like, which is in the black boxes, you have your tactics. And then if you go down each one of the tactics, there's different techniques. So these are all the different TTPs that Microsoft Defender for Office will identify. These are all, and by the way, these are not all of them. This is just what I could fit on the PowerPoint. All of the Microsoft Defender for Identity TTPs that were identified as part of the threat library, as well as the MCAS, which unfortunately is not MCAS anymore. They changed the name to Defender for Cloud Apps, right? That's another thing that Microsoft is working on, the renaming every 6 months. But
yeah, Ariel, one quick question we got here, because there are a lot of other products besides Microsoft. So for instance, one of the questions here, there's Prisma, there's Laceworks. How does Microsoft Defender differ from those type of products?
All right, I love that question because it's the perfect segue into the next slide. But that's a really good question, because I know we have kind of articulated a native approach in the Microsoft ecosystem, but that's a great point, right? Not every organization is going to be 100% Microsoft, right? You're going to have things like Prisma, you're going to have things like Laceworks, you're going to have things like all the different perimeter firewalls, right? That could be Palo Alto, Fortinet, Checkpoint, Cisco, whatever it may be. So that's where, if you can see here on the left-hand side, you have all of the different integrations that you can do into Azure Sentinel, right? Azure Sentinel becomes your aggregation, so it's your SIM, right? Well, just like we talked about, is going to aggregate all the telemetry that's coming out of all of these different platforms and then organize it using the threat library to make sure that you identify everything in each asset when it comes to threats and vulnerability. But it's also going to absorb, because it's technology agnostic, you're going to be able to absorb all of the telemetry outside of everything outside of Microsoft, right? Remember how I said earlier when we started that Azure Sentinel is agnostic to licensing. And that's one of the reasons, right? Because it needs to do its job in the aggregation part, which is the SIM, not just with Microsoft, but with everything else. So Azure Sentinel comes out of the gate with about 100 and close to 150 different, I call them the easy buttons, which are connectors that are very, very quick to integrate pieces of to each of the technologies, right? So if you want to integrate to your Prisma, you can go to the Palo Alto category and boom, integrate to Prisma and start absorbing that telemetry into Azure Sentinel. You can do that with pretty much any sort of integration, even if it's custom or legacy, via syslog, traditional syslog, and or custom integration if it's something really legacy. So with Azure Sentinel, you can really start now having the ability to do everything we talked about across all your different clouds, all your different on-prem, and then going outside of your Microsoft M365 Defender suite of products. Because now you can start going to your third party and absorbing that telemetry, right? And start doing that correlation and enriching those vulnerabilities with each of the assets, as well as determining the fidelity of the threat. But the next thing that Azure Sentinel is a complete differentiator, and Microsoft really did a good job, because when Microsoft Sentinel came out, everyone could remember there was already a sleuth of SIEMs out there. You know, you had IBM was strong in the market when Azure Sentinel came out. Google had their first release as well, but that didn't do so good, right? You have things like Exabeam, Logarithm, you know, Splunk. There's a lot of different SIEMs out in the market, but Azure Sentinel was a little different and became extremely competitive right out of the gate, because it gave you a SIEM, but at the same time, it gave you a SOAR in the same technology. And they did not charge for the SOAR part. And they only charge on the SIEM part if it's a billable log sources, right? And I know I'm circling back some of the things I said originally, because it's a key point of understanding how to get the return on investment from Microsoft, right? As you go into the bundling, right? Yes, there's a premium on the bundle, but overall, there's an extreme cost saving, because as you're moving all of that telemetry, because you already have the licensing for these technologies, all of that telemetry now goes into Azure Sentinel as a non-billable log source. So in normal scenarios, going back to any of the other competition, right, that I just mentioned, you're going to pay twice, because you have to pay for the licensing and the telemetry that's going into the product. And then as that telemetry gets exported from the EDR or any sort of security solution and they go into the SIEM, you're charging again, right? With Sentinel and the whole Microsoft ecosystem, they said, okay, if it comes from our licensing bundle, that telemetry is non-billable. Now, anything outside, of course, we're gonna start charging for it, and that becomes your legacy antivirus. Like we do a lot of integrations with Symantec still, right? Because they're still taking out Symantec out of the environment takes like 5 years. So there's there's a lot of integrations on that, integrating perimeter firewalls, proxies. There's a lot of different third-party security and network tools that still need to be ingested into the SIEM, because those are critical, right? When you're doing an investigation and you get a critical alert coming out of any of the technologies, either third party or Microsoft, one of the things that you want to do from an incident response perspective is launch additional queries. You know, you can call them threat hunting or just enrichment queries, to make sure that is that alert really a classification of patient zero, or are we're going to utilize the horsepower of Sentinel to make sure that we could then search quickly, instantly across landscape of all of the different connected sources that we have. So if there's a malicious IP on the endpoint, I want to quickly scan everything else to see, is this really patient zero, or were there other logs that already identified these IOCs elsewhere? So I can have a real contextualized case management in front of me to determine how to perform the handling of that incident. And that is key into like the Blue Voyant services, into what we do here, where we manage everything together as a whole, right? So that literally, just to kind of circle back on it, it's anything from the M365, the Azure Defender, as well as every piece of the security and network third-party integration. I mentioned that the Azure Sentinel has about 150. The Blue Voyant database also has about another 150 databases in the database for additional connections. So there's a really big breadth of different types of connection that you can do without even worrying about having to custom deliver an integration point. And the funny thing is, everything I just said, I haven't even touched about, right, the security orchestration automation aspect of it, because everything that we just talked about so far was the capability of the SIEM. And SIEM is great. You need a SIEM, but SIEM, remember, always stops at the detection. And detection is great, but detection without response is useless. So we want to make sure that when you detect something in the Azure Sentinel platform across everything that we just talked about, all the different integration, all of the different enrichment process we're going to do, right, that becomes also a capability to do something about it. So now SOAR starts coming in. That Power Automate capability of Azure and Microsoft inside of Sentinel really comes in handy, because now we can do things like, okay, if we have a phishing campaign or a ransomware campaign, and I'll use those two because they're very easy examples, we could definitely take action because we have access into Azure AD, we have access into domain controllers with the sensor, we have access to Defender for Endpoint, we have access to actually perform automations into those technologies and isolate the machine, remove the user's MFA, revoke it. Worst case scenario, disable the user. We can remove files. So we can start doing instantaneously automated deployment of safeguards within the network. Because one of the things that's changed in the last couple of years is, if you were to talk to me 3 years ago, 5 years ago, and you said, listen, I had a ransomware that spread, but by the way, this asset that's being alerted here is the CFO. People would have said, wait, that needs glove treatment, call them, but don't isolate the machine because it's a CFO. Because of how broad that threat has become when it comes phishing, of exfiltration of data, or lateral movement with ransomware, that's not the case anymore. What I'm hearing from every single client is, if you know for a fact that there's an infection being spread of ransomware, I want those machines isolated. No one cares anymore if it's the CFO's machine or if it's, that kiosk in the laundry room. Everything automatically just gets isolated. We fix the problem, we communicate, we do all the logistics and communications, of course, in parallel, but you fix the problem first. You do not let the threat become rampant within the environment. And the only way to do that is through the SOAR platform, because that's how it gives you kind of the ability to go into these technologies and start doing all of that communication. So that's the full automation. And by the way, that's where in the MDR, right, talking services, that's where the managed detection and response kind of capitalize that R and starts becoming managed detection and response ultimately with remediation, right? The little R becomes big R. And you need a SOAR platform in order to capitalize that R to a full remediation. And lastly, you want to be able to integrate all of that into an ITSM platform. So because everyone uses at least some sort of ticketing system. So you want to make sure that there's management of, through ServiceNow, it's a perfect example of all the case management and all the different things that are happening with Azure Sentinel in the notes, that also links to an SDLC, links to an approval process. There's a lot of different workflows and services runbooks that need to be tied out in the organization. And the way that Azure Sentinel does that is by having a tie out into ITSM integrations like ServiceNow, right? All right, Kevin, we're good. Any questions?
No questions, except maybe from me a little bit. So, yeah, with Sentinel, it seems like even if you had a new company that you brought in that wasn't using the same detection software and solutions, you could actually integrate them all into Sentinel, even though they might be using different products.
Yes, 100%. If you want to integrate something that's already there, and let's say you go in and you export your integrations, we can quickly do the same integrations in Sentinel. And when I mean quickly, I really mean it's quickly. With the amount of integrations that already exist in the database, we normally take about less than a couple of days to do full integration of 20, 30, 40 log sources, right? So when I mean quickly, I mean it's really quick to do those connections. So yeah, there's really no bottleneck per se in the migration of log sources, because there's a compliance piece that's attached to that, right? So this is the tricky part, and actually from a technical perspective, that's a really good question, because compliance says that you have to have retention at all times, right? So when you're migrating, you want to make sure that you're migrating to a platform that it's going to give you the least possible gap. A lot of technologies don't let you do dual logging, where you could send a dual log to 2 different SIMs. But what we do with the connector in Sentinel is that we fully configure, and all you do is kind of switch off, switch on. So it's the technology itself is going to queue up enough of a time where when Sentinel lights out and it starts forwarding logs to Sentinel, that queue gets updated in Sentinel and you don't lose any of the retention that compliance is breathing down your back to, for the organization to constantly always have no ifs or buts. So that's a good question from a technical perspective, because we could quickly migrate from one SIEM to the other using Sentinel without having, right, almost to no retention gap in between the two. Which, if you ever been in the past, I'm going back, let's say like 5 years, if you ever did a SIEM to SIEM, there was always going to be a huge gap, within probably days of one solution to the other.
Well, especially with companies merging and people buying people, this has to be something that happens on a daily basis.
Yeah, we do a lot of M&A activities, not just organic growth. And actually, Azure Sentinel has has two built-in scaling capabilities. One, that it's able to integrate into multiple log analytical workspaces to identify and do the enrichment and do the kind of the SIEM piece on top of the data, as well as, and you can actually see here in the diagram, Azure Lighthouse is a protocol that gives the ability to link multiple customers and manage all of them through that one configuration. So that's another way. And we in Blue Point also use Azure Lighthouse heavily, because that's how we integrate into the tenant of the client.
So that's how a managed service would manage more than one account.
Exactly. So we're able to scale without ever having to worry about liability. And what I mean by that is, because of Azure Lighthouse, all of the data we just talked about that's coming out of your endpoint, your threats, your vulnerabilities, you're managing all these different correlations and intelligence. All of that stays within the customer's tenant. Everything is done within the tenant, because Azure Lighthouse gives us the ability for us to kind of, be sitting next to you when we're really not, because of that configuration. So that liability concern of, oh, where's my data? Did you exfiltrate my data out? Are you managing elsewhere? Where is it? What's the policy for data at rest? All of those questions just become moot. Because your data never leaves the environment. And Azure Lighthouse in Microsoft gives the ability for the MSSP to come in and do exactly that work without ever even, exfiltrating one piece of data. So no PHI, no PII, no nothing.
Perfect. Okay.
All right. And then lastly is the proposed solution of kind of everything we just talked about, right? What's the value, the straight to the point summarization of the ROI on the Microsoft investment, right? You want to make sure that you have a service provider that's able to deploy everything, turnkey solution, right? From everything we just talked about: Defender for Office, Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Identity, the Cloud App Security, Sentinel, everything. And in a way that's, best of breed. If Microsoft right now, you go to their websites and you were to download the deployment and best practices guide, that was actually written by Blue Voyant. So that tells you that type of accelerator work and the pedigree you're getting behind it is the same that Microsoft is delivering on their websites to, their thousands of customers. We wrote that particular deployment guide and best practices guide. And the outcome becomes, fast time to value. We just talked about that recently when you're moving from one SIEM to the other. So you want to be able to go from one to the other without losing any operational efficiency, right? Your noise reduction, that is by far one of the biggest issues I've seen in every single SOC that I've ever either managed or have been part and contracted to create efficiencies on. Because there's alert fatigue everywhere. There's so many different alerts. There's so many blinky lights that what happens is, going back to Target, they just click on it and they don't do anything about it because they're just tired of seeing it. So one of the things that needs to happen there, and is very critical, is that log optimization is very critical to make sure that noise reduction and that alert fatigue, right, actually, gets toned down as much as possible. So it's very, very critical to do those two things. Increase the security and visibility. That is the other aspect. That's the other aspect of the coin, because you want to be able to reduce, right, the alert fatigue. You want to be able to reduce the noise, but at the same time, without ever losing visibility into what's really critical in security, right? You bring down the noise of things that are of no value when it comes to incident response and the risk, when that's the threat and the vulnerability, right? With the impact to the organization, like we talked about in the very first slide. You want to be able to bring down that noise reduction, that alert fatigue, so your analysts are not overwhelmed every single minute of the day, but at the same time, not lose your security posture and increase that security and visibility across a bigger breadth of your landscape, going from your on-prem to your cloud to just overall everywhere that the organization does business, right? The cloud spend optimization, that's another huge deal. That's your financial. That's the conversation of licensing. That's the conversation of optimizing your ingestion. How about that? You know, we at Blue Void normally average about a 40% reduction of logs for every single deployment. And we do that through strict filtering that we do at the collector level. So we're able to make sure that we not only reduce the noise by 40%, which gives you, you know, a better cloud spend optimization, but as well as making sure that you get a better utilization of your licensing and the integration across all of them with Azure Sentinel, right? Also lowering the total cost of ownership, and lastly, data privacy, right? You want to be able to do all that without ever worrying about, you know, your data elsewhere. And Lighthouse really becomes a critical piece of integration and technology. It's actually a protocol, right? To make sure that data privacy is a main topic of concern when we're doing the services and you're getting a full ROI, because Microsoft releases Lighthouse and they did it exactly for that, to make sure that when there's an MSSP doing the services, you're getting, because of the technology features, you're getting full ROI on everything. So I'll stop here just to give like a couple minutes for Q&A. You know, I want to thank everyone, Kevin and everyone for attending, but if there's any questions, let's talk about them.
Yeah, just chat. Anything you want to know from Ariel, we'll be more than happy for you. But if for some reason, you know, you want to get a lot more information, get a sit down, actually maybe go over what your strategy is now, how maybe a managed service provider can help you be, you know, a lot more secure and maybe a little bit more efficient in what you do, please reach out for your serious rep. He'll be able to get a hold of myself or Ariel or anyone on the team here and be able to at least give you a nice rundown on your environment, see how you can maximize your investment in Microsoft. You might be spending money on things outside of Microsoft that you're paying Microsoft for. So, you know, part of what we do is help you optimize that spend, that investment in Microsoft, and take care of what you can with the money you're already spending. So I don't see any questions here yet, Ariel, but we'll hang around here for, you know, a couple of minutes. You know, if you do have any questions, we will be following up with you. We'll send you out the presentation. We did record this webinar, so you'll be able to share it with friends. Any questions, please ask them right now.
Well, I do have a follow-up.
Yep, we will. We absolutely will. But Ariel, thanks a lot for your time today. I know you this is all you do, so I know that this is your you know, your love and what you spend your whole day doing. So I appreciate you taking an hour out of your time to you know, send this wisdom along. Oh, I got a question here. Through Azure Lighthouse, will we access the Sentinel of a customer in our tenant?
Yes.
The answer is yes.
Yep. Again, not to go into the nitty gritty and the ways of Lighthouse, but yes, you can use it. You can use Lighthouse for the services, right? From an MSSP, right? That's how they're going to get to the environment. But you could also use it internally if you have, let's say, an M&A type of structure, or you have a parent company with a child company. You can always use that as well.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So if you have companies that aren't maybe part of your corporate structure, but you own them and they're a separate entity, you could use Lighthouse in that format too.
Exactly.
Oh, perfect.
I'm actually in the midst of that configuration right now with a cluster of colleges.
Colleges, great. Hey,
Yeah.
I never thought of that, but you're right.
Yeah.
All this will sync in 20 minutes. That's a question from Jason Adams.
So, okay, when you mean sync in 20 minutes, you're talking about the configuration taking place for access to be eligible? Is that, if that is where you're coming from, yeah, it's pretty much instantly. So once you create your Lighthouse configuration, think about it as a federated, two entities being federated is pretty much instantly.
So Jason, it looks like the answer is yes, 20 minutes and your, anything that you have out there will appear almost instantly in Sentinel.
Yeah, and just to add to that, with our services, we already have everything already pre-created. So it's turnkey. So we'll give you all of the configuration. It's a zero trust model behind the configuration. So we'll walk you through implementing Lighthouse. We have everything already pre-configured. So yeah, if that question is from a configurational perspective, yeah, it's also 20 minutes. So it's a yes and a yes, depending on where the question came from.
So that makes it easy. It's yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Well, we appreciate your time today. Please reach out to your Sirius rep, reach out to anyone that can help you. And Ariel, great job. Anything we can do for you, Ariel, myself, or the Sirius team, we're here for you. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.